The most expensive room in the city became silent because of one girl's tears, and I never imagined those tears would change my life forever. My name is Charlotte Brooks, and if you had walked into the Grand Ashton Hotel that evening, you probably would have mistaken me for every other server carrying silver trays beneath sparkling chandeliers. That was the point. People like me were supposed to blend into the background while the wealthy celebrated another successful year of business, philanthropy, and influence. The ballroom glowed beneath warm golden light that reflected across polished marble floors like liquid sunlight. Crystal glasses shimmered in every direction, laughter floated through the air beside the gentle melody of a live string quartet, and designer gowns brushed against tailored tuxedos as though everyone belonged inside a perfect painting. I did not belong there. I was 25 years old, working my third event that week, saving every dollar I could to finish nursing school before another tuition payment came due. My shoes pinched my feet after 6 straight hours of standing, but smiling had become part of the uniform. Guests rarely noticed the people serving them unless something went wrong. I reminded myself to stay invisible. Invisible people finished their shifts without problems. Invisible people went home with their jobs intact. As I carefully carried a tray filled with sparkling water across the ballroom, I noticed a little girl standing alone near an elaborate floral display almost as tall as she was. She looked frightened, searching the crowd for someone she recognized. I offered her a gentle smile, and before I could even ask if she was lost, she pointed toward a towering dessert display that had begun leaning after another child accidentally bumped the table. Without thinking, I hurried forward and steadied the silver stand before dozens of delicate pastries crashed onto the marble floor. The little girl laughed with relief before running back into her mother's arms, who never realized what had almost happened. Moments like that reminded me why kindness never needed an audience. I returned to my tray and continued walking, believing the evening had survived its closest disaster. Then fate chose a much smaller mistake. The edge of my shoe caught the corner of an elegant carpet. Time seemed to slow as the silver tray slipped from my hands. Crystal glasses struck the marble with a sound that echoed through the ballroom like breaking ice across a frozen lake. Conversation stopped. Music faded into silence. Hundreds of eyes turned toward me at exactly the same moment. My heart pounded so loudly I barely heard my manager whisper my name from across the room. Heat rushed into my cheeks while I knelt to gather glittering fragments scattered beneath the chandeliers. I apologized over and over, even though nobody answered. Then someone sighed loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. Another guest quietly remarked that standards were not what they used to be. Soft laughter drifted through the crowd. I tried to swallow the lump in my throat. I had promised myself years ago that no stranger would ever see me cry again. But promises become fragile when humiliation arrives without warning. One tear escaped before I could stop it, falling onto the polished marble beside a broken piece of crystal that reflected the ballroom lights like a tiny shattered star. I reached to wipe it away, believing no one had noticed. I was wrong. Across the ballroom, standing near the grand staircase with calm confidence that seemed untouched by the noise around him, one man had been watching everything. While everyone else saw an embarrassed server, his steady gray eyes seemed to recognize something far deeper, and somehow, before either of us spoke a single word, I felt as though the most powerful stranger in the room had just seen the parts of me I had spent years trying to hide. For several long seconds, I could not move. The warmth of his hand had already disappeared, yet the quiet certainty in his voice lingered in my thoughts as though the ballroom itself had memorized every word. Around us, employees hurried to sweep away the shattered crystal while the orchestra cautiously resumed its melody, pretending nothing unusual had happened. That was how elegant evenings survived uncomfortable moments. They simply continued. I bent down to help collect the last few fragments, but my manager gently stopped me. "Charlotte," he whispered, his expression softer than I had ever seen it, "go to the staff room for a few minutes. We will finish here." I nodded gratefully and slipped through the service corridor, away from the glittering lights and carefully rehearsed smiles. The quiet hallway felt almost unreal after the noise of the ballroom. I leaned against the cool wall and closed my eyes, taking one slow breath after another until my heartbeat finally settled. When I looked into the small mirror above the sink inside the staff room, I barely recognized the woman staring back at me. My makeup remained neat, my uniform was still pressed, but my eyes told the truth that no amount of professionalism could hide. I splashed cold water across my hands and reminded myself why I had accepted this extra shift. Nursing school tuition was due in 12 days. My landlord had already called twice about next month's rent. Missing even one night's wages was not an option. I folded a clean towel, straightened my name tag, and walked back toward the ballroom with the determination that life had taught me years ago. The guests had already returned to their conversations as though nothing had happened. Wealth had a remarkable ability to erase uncomfortable memories. Yet one thing had changed. Wherever Ethan Carter stood, people instinctively gave him space. Men who had been speaking confidently only moments earlier now waited patiently before approaching him. Women greeted him with polite smiles rather than exaggerated charm. Even members of the hotel staff seemed noticeably calmer whenever he passed. Nobody appeared intimidated. Instead, they behaved as though disappointing him would somehow disappoint themselves. I had never witnessed influence expressed so quietly. As I collected empty glasses from a nearby table, 2 elderly donors spoke softly beside me, assuming no one else was listening. "He has funded the children's hospital again," one of them said with admiration. "3rd year in a row." The other smiled. "And he still refuses to let them name the new wing after him." Their conversation continued as I moved away, but those few sentences remained with me. The man everyone respected had never once mentioned himself during our brief encounter. He had not asked my name. He had not expected gratitude. He had simply reminded an entire room that kindness still mattered. I glanced across the ballroom without meaning to. Ethan was standing near the grand staircase speaking with several board members, but before anyone else noticed, his eyes lifted and met mine once again. There was no awkwardness in his expression, no curiosity, no judgment. He simply offered the smallest nod, almost impossible to notice unless someone was already looking. I answered with a hesitant smile before returning to my work, unaware that somewhere beyond the polished marble floors and sparkling chandeliers, the quiet exchange between 2 complete strangers had already begun changing the course of both our lives. The gala finally came to an end just after 11:30, but the memories of that evening followed me long after the last chandelier dimmed behind me. I changed out of my uniform in the small employee locker room, folded it neatly into my canvas bag, and stepped outside into the cool Manhattan air. The city looked completely different after midnight. Office towers reflected across rain-soaked sidewalks, yellow taxis drifted through quiet intersections, and the noise that usually filled every street had softened into a distant hum. I pulled my jacket tighter and started the 6-block walk toward the subway station. It was cheaper than taking a cab, and every dollar mattered. As I walked, I replayed every strange moment from the ballroom. The broken glasses. The uncomfortable silence. The calm stranger who had somehow turned humiliation into dignity without embarrassing me even further. I shook my head, trying to convince myself that I would probably never see Ethan Carter again. Men like him lived in a completely different world. Tomorrow morning he would return to boardrooms, charity meetings, and luxury apartments overlooking Central Park. Tomorrow morning I would return to anatomy textbooks, hospital volunteer hours, and another shift serving people who rarely remembered my face. Those 2 lives were never supposed to cross twice. By the time I reached the subway entrance, light rain had begun to fall. I hurried down the concrete stairs just as the train doors were closing, slipping inside with only seconds to spare. The nearly empty car smelled faintly of coffee and wet coats. I found a seat beside the window and watched the city lights blur together as the train disappeared beneath the streets. My phone vibrated inside my bag. It was a message from my younger sister, Lily. "Are you still awake?" I smiled despite my exhaustion and called her immediately. She answered on the second ring. "How was the fancy party?" she asked cheerfully. "Did you meet any celebrities?" I laughed quietly. "Not exactly." She could always make difficult days feel lighter. We talked for several minutes about her college classes, our grandmother's doctor appointment later that week, and whether I was remembering to eat enough during my double shifts. I never told her about crying at the gala. She already worried about me too much. When the train reached my stop in Queens, I wished her good night and climbed back into the cool evening air. My apartment building stood exactly where it always had, small, aging, and surrounded by flower boxes that one of my elderly neighbors insisted on watering every morning. It was not glamorous, but it was home. I unlocked the front door, quietly greeted Mrs. Alvarez from the first floor as she finished watering her plants, and climbed the narrow staircase to my apartment. After placing my bag on the kitchen chair, I opened the refrigerator and smiled at its familiar emptiness except for milk, eggs, and leftover soup. Tomorrow was grocery day if my paycheck cleared on time. I changed into comfortable clothes, opened my nursing textbook, and tried to study cardiovascular anatomy. Instead, I found myself remembering one simple sentence. There is nothing here worth losing your dignity over. I closed the book with a sigh. Somewhere across the city, Ethan Carter had probably forgotten our brief conversation already. I told myself I should do the same. Yet deep inside, a quiet feeling refused to disappear, as though life had gently opened a door neither of us realized had been waiting all along. Morning arrived before I felt ready to face it. The first pale rays of sunlight slipped through the worn curtains of my small apartment, painting quiet lines across the kitchen table where my anatomy textbook still lay open from the night before. I had fallen asleep with a highlighter in one hand and a notebook beneath my cheek, waking only when my alarm insisted that another day had already begun. I brewed the last of my coffee, packed a simple lunch into my faded canvas bag, and checked the calendar taped to my refrigerator. Tuition payment was due in less than 3 weeks. Rent followed only days later. Every square on that calendar carried another responsibility waiting for me. I pulled on my light blue sweater, tied my hair into a neat ponytail, and hurried toward the subway station with barely enough time to catch the morning train. Nursing school demanded discipline, but it also reminded me every day why I refused to quit. During our clinical skills lab, we practiced patient assessments under the careful guidance of our instructor. Most of my classmates laughed during breaks, making plans for the weekend or talking about family vacations. I smiled whenever they included me, but my thoughts remained fixed on part-time shifts, overdue bills, and finding enough hours in every day to keep moving forward. After class ended, I crossed campus to the community health clinic where I volunteered twice each week. The waiting room was already full. Elderly couples, young parents, and children carrying worn backpacks filled nearly every chair. I greeted each patient with the same smile I wished someone had given me on difficult days. A little boy nervously held his mother's hand before his appointment. I knelt beside him and handed him a box of crayons from the reception desk. Within minutes he was smiling while drawing a bright red fire truck across a sheet of paper. His mother quietly thanked me with tired eyes that said more than words ever could. Sometimes kindness was the only medicine available before a doctor entered the room. Late that afternoon, Dr. Lawson asked me to stay behind after the last patient left. He rested a folder on his desk before looking at me with a thoughtful expression. "Charlotte," he said gently, "someone attended the charity gala last night and called this morning asking about the volunteer who helped stabilize the dessert display before it fell. They remembered your name." I blinked in surprise. "They called the clinic?" He nodded. "Apparently they support several medical education programs around the city. They asked whether you were as dependable here as you appeared last night." My heart skipped a beat. "What did you tell them?" A warm smile crossed his face. "I told them you are one of the hardest working students I have ever supervised." He slid the folder across the desk. Inside was information about a competitive nursing scholarship sponsored by a private charitable foundation. Applications closed in 48 hours. "I think you should apply," he said quietly. I looked down at the paperwork, unable to explain why my thoughts immediately returned to one calm voice inside a ballroom filled with strangers. Perhaps it was only coincidence. Perhaps someone else had noticed me. Yet as I stepped outside into the cool afternoon breeze, carrying the folder tightly against my chest, I could not shake the feeling that one unexpected encounter had quietly begun opening doors I had never believed someone like me would ever have the chance to walk through. The following evening, I returned to the Grand Ashton Hotel for another shift, expecting nothing more than another long night of smiling politely and disappearing into the background. The ballroom looked completely different without the charity gala. Smaller corporate receptions had replaced the glittering celebration, and the familiar chandeliers cast a softer glow across neatly arranged tables. I tied my apron, adjusted my name tag, and reminded myself that ordinary routines were comforting. Extraordinary nights belonged in memories, not real life. Halfway through the evening, my manager approached carrying a sealed ivory envelope. "Charlotte," he said, looking genuinely puzzled, "this was delivered for you at the front desk about an hour ago." I accepted it carefully, surprised that anyone would know where to find me. There was no return address, only my name written in elegant handwriting across the front. I waited until my break before opening it inside the quiet employee lounge. Inside rested a single folded card and a brochure for a nursing scholarship foundation. My hands became still as I read the brief handwritten message. Opportunities often arrive disguised as ordinary days. Do not let this one pass you by. There was no signature. Nothing that explained who had sent it. I turned the card over several times, searching for any clue, but there was only blank cream-colored paper. The brochure described a scholarship that would cover tuition, books, and clinical expenses for students committed to community health care. The application deadline was only 2 days away. My heart began racing. I had never even heard of the foundation before. During the rest of my shift, I could barely focus on balancing trays or refilling coffee cups. Questions circled endlessly through my mind. Who had sent it? Why me? Had someone from the gala remembered our brief conversation? Every possibility felt equally impossible. After work, instead of taking the subway straight home, I stopped at the public library near Bryant Park to research the foundation. It was real. Well-respected. Highly competitive. Hundreds of students applied every year, yet only a handful received awards. I downloaded every application form I could find and hurried home carrying a folder that suddenly felt heavier than my backpack. My tiny apartment became a command center for the next several hours. Recommendation letters, volunteer records, academic transcripts, and personal essays covered every inch of my kitchen table. Midnight came and went without me noticing. As I searched through old files, my phone rang. It was Lily. My younger sister immediately noticed the excitement in my voice. "Something good happened, did not it?" she asked. I smiled. "I do not know yet. Maybe. I have a chance." She laughed softly. "Charlotte, you have spent your whole life creating chances. Maybe this one finally found you first." After we ended the call, I sat quietly by the apartment window watching gentle rain blur the city lights outside. The mysterious note rested beside my laptop. Whoever had sent it expected nothing in return. They had not offered money. They had not asked for gratitude. They had simply pointed me toward a door I had never known existed. As I reached for the scholarship application and began typing the first sentence, I realized that for the first time since the gala, I was no longer thinking about the embarrassment that had brought me to tears. I was thinking about the unexpected kindness that had quietly followed me home. 2 mornings later, my phone rang while I was organizing patient files at the community clinic. I almost ignored the unfamiliar number, assuming it was another telemarketer, but something urged me to answer anyway. "Hello, this is Charlotte Brooks." A warm professional voice greeted me immediately. "Good morning, Miss Brooks. This is Rebecca Collins from the Ashton Medical Education Foundation. Is this still a good time to talk?" My heart skipped a beat. I stepped into the quiet hallway outside the records room before answering. "Yes, absolutely." She paused only long enough to make me hold my breath. "I am pleased to inform you that you have been selected as one of this year's scholarship finalists. We would like to invite you for a personal interview next Thursday afternoon." For a second I forgot how to speak. I had prepared myself for rejection so completely that hearing the opposite felt almost unreal. "Thank you," I finally whispered. "Thank you so much." After we ended the call, I remained standing beside the hallway window, watching autumn sunlight spill across the parking lot. Patients continued arriving. Nurses greeted one another. Ambulances came and went. The entire world continued moving exactly as it had an hour earlier, yet somehow everything inside me had changed. Later that afternoon I stopped by Dr. Lawson's office to share the news. Before I could finish the first sentence, he stood and shook my hand with genuine pride. "I knew they would see what I have seen for years," he said with a smile. "No matter what happens next week, remember that reaching this stage is already an achievement." His words settled my nerves more than he probably realized. That evening I returned home carrying library books about interview preparation and professional communication. My tiny apartment quickly filled with handwritten notes taped beside the bathroom mirror, across the refrigerator, and even above the kitchen sink. I practiced answering questions while washing dishes. Why nursing? What motivates you? What kind of nurse do you hope to become? Every answer always returned to the same truth. I wanted people to feel safe when life frightened them most. 2 days before the interview, another unexpected surprise arrived. As I stepped out of my apartment building on my way to class, Mrs. Alvarez called my name from her front porch. She held a neatly wrapped garment bag in her hands. "Charlotte," she said with a grandmotherly smile, "my daughter left this after a business event last month. It should fit you perfectly. I think someone interviewing for a scholarship deserves to walk in feeling confident." I hesitated. I cannot accept something so nice. She gently placed the bag into my hands anyway. "You are not accepting it forever. You are borrowing confidence until yours catches up." I laughed softly despite the tears gathering in my eyes. Later that evening I unzipped the garment bag and found a beautiful navy blue blazer that looked elegant without being extravagant. It fit almost perfectly. Standing in front of the mirror, I barely recognized the reflection smiling back at me. For the first time in years, I was not preparing for another shift serving someone else's dreams. I was preparing to speak about my own, and somewhere in the quiet corners of my heart, I found myself wondering if Ethan Carter somehow already knew that the door he had quietly encouraged me to walk toward was finally beginning to open. The days leading up to the interview passed more quickly than I expected. Every morning began before sunrise and ended long after the city lights reflected across my apartment window. Between classes, volunteer hours, and evening shifts, I rehearsed interview questions whenever I found a quiet moment. I practiced while riding the subway, while washing dishes, and even while waiting for coffee to brew. The answers never sounded perfect, but they sounded honest, and I hoped honesty would be enough. On Wednesday afternoon, after finishing a long clinical lab, I stopped by the community clinic to complete another volunteer shift. The waiting room was unusually busy because several neighboring offices had closed early, sending more patients our way. Children colored quietly at a small table while elderly couples patiently waited for their appointments. The familiar rhythm of the clinic always settled my nerves. No matter how uncertain life became, kindness still had a place there. As I organized medical files behind the reception desk, Dr. Lawson approached carrying a clipboard and smiled the way mentors do when they already know something encouraging. "Charlotte, do you have a minute?" he asked. I followed him into his office, expecting another volunteer assignment. Instead, he handed me a neatly folded letter sealed inside a cream-colored envelope. "One of our longtime donors asked me to give you this before tomorrow," he explained. "He said you should read it tonight, not sooner." My curiosity grew stronger, but I slipped the envelope into my backpack exactly as he requested. Before leaving, Dr. Lawson rested a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "Remember something," he said gently. "Scholarships are awarded because of grades, experience, and recommendations. But people remember character long after paperwork is forgotten." His words stayed with me throughout the subway ride home. That evening my apartment felt unusually quiet. Rain tapped softly against the window while the radiator hummed in the corner. I heated a bowl of vegetable soup, reviewed my notes one final time, and finally opened the envelope resting on the kitchen table. Inside was a simple handwritten card. The message was brief. Walk into the room exactly as you are. The right people will recognize what cannot be written on a resume. There was no signature. Once again, whoever had sent it chose encouragement over recognition. I smiled quietly, placing the card beside the first anonymous note I had received days earlier. Whether they came from the same person or not, both messages carried the same quiet belief that I had struggled to find inside myself. Before going to bed, I carefully pressed my borrowed navy blazer, polished my shoes, and placed every interview document into a leather folder so I would not forget anything in the morning. Then I stood by the apartment window looking across the city skyline glowing beneath the evening clouds. Somewhere beyond those lights, thousands of people were ending ordinary days without realizing they might wake to extraordinary opportunities. Tomorrow could change everything, or it could change nothing at all. Either way, I had decided that fear would no longer be the loudest voice inside my heart. As I turned off the lights and prepared for the few hours of sleep waiting before dawn, I realized that for the first time since the night of the gala, I was no longer measuring my future by the mistakes I had made. I was beginning to measure it by the courage to keep walking forward. Thursday morning arrived wrapped in crisp autumn air and the quiet kind of hope that made every heartbeat feel louder than usual. I stood outside the Ashton Medical Education Foundation for nearly a full minute before walking through the revolving doors, reminding myself that I belonged there just as much as anyone else. The borrowed navy blazer rested comfortably on my shoulders, and the leather folder in my hands contained every transcript, recommendation letter, and volunteer record that represented years of sacrifice. The reception area overlooked the Manhattan skyline through towering windows, filling the room with warm natural light instead of intimidating luxury. Several other finalists waited nearby, reviewing notes or quietly sipping coffee. For a moment old doubts returned, whispering that everyone else looked more accomplished, more confident, more prepared. Then I remembered the handwritten message that had arrived days earlier. Walk into the room exactly as you are. The right people will recognize what cannot be written on a resume. I took one slow breath and allowed those words to settle my thoughts. A coordinator called my name with a welcoming smile and led me down a quiet hallway decorated with photographs of former scholarship recipients serving patients across hospitals, clinics, and community health centers throughout the country. Looking at those faces reminded me that every one of them had once stood where I was standing now. The interview room surprised me immediately. Instead of a long formal table, comfortable chairs formed a circle beside large windows overlooking the city. 3 committee members greeted me warmly before inviting me to sit. Their questions focused less on achievements and more on people. They asked why I chose nursing instead of another career. They asked what I had learned from volunteering at the community clinic. They asked how I remained compassionate after long days filled with work, school, and responsibility. I answered honestly because honesty had always been the strongest thing I owned. I spoke about frightened patients who needed someone willing to listen before offering solutions. I described elderly neighbors whose loneliness often hurt more than illness. I shared how kindness could calm fear long before medicine ever reached a patient. The conversation felt less like an examination and more like people genuinely trying to understand the person behind the application. Near the end of the interview, one committee member smiled thoughtfully before asking one final question. If you receive this scholarship, what will success mean to you? I looked toward the skyline beyond the window before answering. Success will not be graduating with honors, I said quietly. Success will be becoming the nurse who makes another person believe that difficult days do not last forever. The room became still for several seconds. Then another committee member nodded with quiet approval. Thank you, Miss Brooks. That is a memorable answer. The interview concluded with warm handshakes and sincere smiles. As I stepped back into the reception area, I noticed a familiar figure standing near the window speaking with the foundation president. Ethan Carter turned almost at the exact moment I looked up. He ended his conversation politely before walking toward me with the same calm confidence I remembered from the gala. How do you feel? He asked. I laughed softly. Relieved. I finally stopped trying to sound impressive and simply told the truth. His gray eyes reflected quiet satisfaction. The truth has a way of introducing people better than perfection ever could. I smiled, realizing that no matter what decision the committee eventually made, I would leave that building carrying something far more valuable than confidence borrowed from others. For the first time in years, I had found confidence that truly belonged to me. The week that followed felt strangely peaceful, as though life had decided to give me a brief moment to breathe after years of running uphill. Classes continued. Volunteer shifts filled my afternoons. Evening work at the hotel remained part of my routine, yet something inside me had quietly changed. I no longer walked through each day wondering whether I was good enough. I simply focused on becoming better than I had been the day before. One Friday evening, after finishing a long shift at the community clinic, Dr. Lawson asked if I could deliver several donated medical supply boxes to a neighborhood outreach center a few blocks away. The foundation supporting the center had recently expanded its free wellness programs, and volunteers were helping organize the new space before opening day. I gladly accepted. Carrying 2 medium-sized boxes through the front entrance, I immediately noticed the building felt alive with purpose. Volunteers arranged bookshelves, nurses prepared examination rooms, and children laughed while decorating colorful bulletin boards. It reminded me why I had chosen nursing in the first place. No one was asking who had the nicest suit or the largest bank account. Everyone was simply trying to help. I had just finished stacking supplies inside a storage room when I heard a familiar voice thanking one of the coordinators nearby. I turned and found Ethan Carter reviewing architectural plans spread across a large conference table. He was dressed simply in a navy sport coat with the sleeves rolled neatly above his wrists, speaking with the project director about expanding pediatric counseling services. There was no ceremony surrounding him, no photographers, no public announcement. If someone had not recognized his face, they would have assumed he was another volunteer helping prepare the building. He looked up, noticed me standing by the doorway, and smiled with genuine surprise. "Charlotte. I did not know you volunteered here as well." I laughed softly. "I did not know you built places like this." He glanced around the nearly completed center before answering. "I only help provide resources. The people working here are the ones who truly build it." That answer stayed with me. Most successful people I had met preferred talking about accomplishments. Ethan always redirected attention toward others. Together we walked through the new clinic while volunteers continued arranging furniture and unpacking donated equipment. Every room had been designed with warmth rather than luxury. Children's artwork already decorated several walls. Comfortable chairs replaced stiff waiting room benches. Sunlight poured through oversized windows, making every hallway feel welcoming instead of clinical. Ethan paused outside a counseling room where a young volunteer carefully arranged children's books onto colorful shelves. "When people arrive here," he said quietly, "I want the building to tell them they matter before anyone even speaks." I looked around the room once more and realized every detail reflected that belief. Compassion had been built into the walls themselves. As the afternoon came to an end, volunteers gathered for coffee and sandwiches before heading home. Watching Ethan thank every single person individually, regardless of their position, explained something I had been trying to understand since the gala. People did not respect him because of influence alone. They respected him because he consistently made other people feel seen. Walking home beneath the soft evening light, I realized that the strongest kind of leadership was almost invisible. It never demanded attention. It quietly inspired everyone nearby to become a little kinder than they had been the day before. Several weeks passed with a quiet rhythm that slowly transformed unfamiliar faces into familiar ones. Between nursing classes, volunteer work, and the scholarship program, my calendar remained as full as ever, but for the first time in years, exhaustion no longer carried the weight of fear. I was no longer racing against unpaid tuition bills. Instead, I was running toward the future I had dreamed about for so long. One afternoon, I received an invitation from the Ashton Foundation to attend a small appreciation luncheon honoring scholarship recipients and community partners. The event was intentionally modest, held inside the newly completed community health center rather than another luxury ballroom. Sunlight streamed through wide windows, children laughed in the waiting area, and volunteers arranged fresh flowers on every table. The building felt alive, not because of expensive architecture, but because every room had already begun serving the people it was created to help. I spent the first hour greeting guests, speaking with physicians, and listening to former scholarship recipients describe their careers. Every conversation reminded me that success rarely arrived all at once. It was built one ordinary day at a time. As I stepped into the courtyard for a breath of fresh air, I found Ethan standing beside a newly planted maple tree, speaking quietly with one of the clinic directors. When their conversation ended, he walked toward me with the same calm confidence that had become strangely comforting. "How are your classes?" he asked. I smiled. "Busy enough to remind me why coffee was invented." He laughed softly, and the sound surprised me. Until then, I had mostly seen the composed businessman who measured every word carefully. That brief laugh revealed something warmer beneath the polished exterior. We walked slowly through the courtyard where families gathered beneath colorful umbrellas while children chased bubbles floating across the afternoon breeze. I noticed that almost every employee greeted Ethan by his first name. Custodians, receptionists, physicians, and volunteers all received the same respectful attention from him. He asked about their families, remembered birthdays, and thanked them individually for their work. Nothing about it appeared rehearsed. "You know everyone here," I said with quiet amazement. Ethan looked around before answering. "Buildings matter less than the people who fill them. If they do not feel valued, then everything else becomes decoration." His words settled gently into my thoughts. Before I could respond, an elderly woman approached us carrying a cane. Ethan immediately stepped aside so she could walk more comfortably, greeting her by name and asking whether her physical therapy sessions were helping. Her face brightened as they spoke for several minutes. When she finally continued inside, she squeezed my hand and whispered, "He never forgets anyone." Watching that simple exchange explained more about Ethan than any newspaper article or business biography ever could. He never used kindness to attract attention. He practiced it because it had become part of who he was. As the luncheon concluded, guests gathered for a group photograph outside the entrance. Someone invited Ethan to stand in the center beside the foundation board, but he quietly declined and encouraged the nurses, volunteers, and scholarship students to take the front row instead. Standing beside him beneath the warm afternoon sun, I realized leadership looked nothing like I had imagined growing up. It was not measured by who stood in front of the crowd. Sometimes it was measured by the person who quietly stepped aside so everyone else could be seen, and in that quiet moment, I understood that the greatest influence was not built through power alone. It was built through humility that never needed recognition. The weeks following the scholarship ceremony settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar because peace had quietly replaced constant uncertainty. My mornings began with lectures, my afternoons belonged to the community clinic, and my evenings were no longer consumed by worrying about tuition bills that had once kept me awake until sunrise. Instead, I found myself thinking about patients I hoped to help someday and conversations that lingered long after they ended. Ethan remained part of my life in the same steady way he had entered it. He never appeared unexpectedly to change my plans or solve my problems. He simply showed up whenever our paths naturally crossed, asking thoughtful questions that made me realize someone had been paying attention to the smallest details I mentioned weeks earlier. One Saturday morning, the community health center hosted its first comprehensive wellness fair for neighborhood families. Volunteers filled every hallway, physicians donated their time, and nursing students like me guided visitors between health screenings, nutrition workshops, and children's activities. The building felt exactly as Ethan had once described it. Before anyone spoke a single word, the space itself seemed to tell people they mattered. Near lunchtime, I stepped outside to organize additional supplies arriving from a local donor. A delivery van pulled away, leaving several boxes stacked beside the entrance. As another volunteer and I carried them inside, I noticed a familiar black sedan stopping quietly across the street. Ethan stepped out dressed in a simple charcoal overcoat, carrying 2 large insulated containers filled with hot soup donated by a neighborhood restaurant. He greeted every volunteer by name before helping distribute meals without drawing attention to himself. Watching him move through the crowded lobby, I realized something that no newspaper article or foundation brochure could ever fully explain. People smiled before he even reached them because they trusted how he made them feel. An elderly woman waiting for her blood pressure screening reached for his hand as he walked by. "You remembered my grandson's graduation," she said with grateful eyes. Ethan smiled warmly. "You told me he wanted to become a firefighter. I wanted to know how his first week went." She laughed with obvious pride before telling the story in great detail, and Ethan listened as though it were the most important conversation of his day. Later that afternoon, after the final patients had gone home and volunteers began folding tables, we found ourselves standing together in the quiet courtyard behind the building. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves, and golden sunlight stretched across the brick walkway between us. "Can I ask you something?" I said softly. Ethan nodded. "Why do you remember so much about everyone?" He looked toward the clinic windows where volunteers were still cleaning inside. "Because people spend enough of their lives feeling overlooked," he answered. "If I have the opportunity to make someone feel remembered instead, then I should not waste it." His words settled deeply inside me. For several moments neither of us spoke. Finally I smiled. "You know, I used to think that the most impressive thing about you was everything you had accomplished." He raised one eyebrow with quiet curiosity. "And now?" I looked at him with complete honesty. "Now I think the most impressive thing is how you make complete strangers feel like they have always mattered." Ethan lowered his eyes for just a moment before meeting mine again, and for the first time since we had met beneath those crystal chandeliers, I saw something unfamiliar behind his calm expression. It was not confidence. It was vulnerability, as though my words had reached a place inside him that very few people had ever been invited to see. The first snow of December arrived quietly, covering rooftops and sidewalks with a thin layer of white that softened every sharp edge of the city. Classes had become more demanding, clinical rotations required longer hours, and the community health center welcomed more patients than ever before, yet I had never felt more certain that I was exactly where I belonged. Every difficult day ended with the same realization. I was no longer chasing a dream. I was living inside it. One Friday afternoon, after finishing my volunteer shift, I received a text message from Ethan asking if I had a few minutes to meet at the community garden behind the health center before heading home. There was nothing unusual about the invitation. Over the past several months, we had shared countless conversations over coffee, during volunteer events, and while walking through neighborhoods that both of us had slowly come to love for different reasons. Still, something about the message felt different. When I arrived, the garden was almost empty. Snow rested gently across the wooden benches, while evergreen trees surrounded the small walking paths with quiet beauty. Ethan stood near the center fountain holding 2 paper cups of hot chocolate instead of coffee. He smiled the moment he saw me. "I thought today called for something warmer," he said, handing me one of the cups. I laughed softly. "You remembered that I only drink hot chocolate when it snows." "I remember most things you tell me," he answered with the same calm honesty that had always made his words feel effortless. We walked slowly through the garden, watching children build tiny snowmen in the nearby park while families hurried home carrying grocery bags and holiday decorations. Neither of us seemed eager to rush the conversation. We spoke about my upcoming clinical rotation, his plans to expand another neighborhood health program, and how the community center had already helped thousands of local families during its first year. Finally we stopped beside a wooden bridge overlooking the frozen pond. Ethan rested his hands lightly against the railing before looking toward the quiet water. "Charlotte," he began, "there is something I have spent months trying to find the right time to say." My heart quietly quickened, though I remained completely calm. I already knew this conversation was not about business, scholarships, or volunteer work. He turned to face me with an openness I had never seen before. "When I first saw you at the gala, I admired your strength. As I came to know you, I admired your compassion even more. Somewhere along the way, admiration became something much deeper. I never wanted gratitude to influence your feelings, which is why I waited until your life belonged entirely to your own choices again. The winter air suddenly felt wonderfully still. Snowflakes drifted silently around us as the city continued moving beyond the trees. I smiled before I even realized I was doing it. I have been afraid of one thing, I admitted quietly. Ethan looked at me with gentle concern. What is that? I laughed softly, shaking my head. That you would never ask. For the first time since we had met, Ethan laughed without restraint, the sound warm enough to brighten the cold afternoon. He reached for my hand slowly, giving me every chance to step away if I wished. Instead, I placed my hand in his without hesitation. There were no grand speeches, no audience, and no dramatic promises. There was only quiet certainty built from months of trust, respect, and kindness. As we continued walking side by side through the softly falling snow, I realized the most important choice of my life had not been accepting a scholarship or pursuing a career. It had been choosing to believe that someone could love me not because I needed saving, but because they had truly seen who I was all along. Nearly 1 year after that unforgettable evening, I found myself walking once again beneath the crystal chandeliers of the Grand Ashton Hotel. The marble floors reflected the same golden light. The orchestra played the same timeless melodies. Guests gathered in elegant attire, exchanging conversations that blended into a gentle hum across the ballroom. Everything looked exactly as it had before, yet nothing inside me was the same. I had completed another successful year of nursing school, continued serving families at the community health center, and discovered that confidence is not something another person gives you. It is something you slowly uncover after choosing courage often enough. This year, I was not carrying a serving tray. I was carrying a small speech prepared for the newest scholarship recipients who sat exactly where I had once dreamed of sitting. As I stepped onto the stage, I recognized the uncertainty in their faces because I had worn that same expression not so long ago. I smiled before speaking, allowing the room to grow quiet. I told them that success rarely begins with certainty. More often, it begins with embarrassment, disappointment, rejection, or fear. I shared how one unexpected moment had convinced me my future was becoming smaller, only to discover that the same moment had quietly opened a door I never knew existed. I thanked the professors who challenged me, the volunteers who became family, Dr. Lawson for believing in my potential before I could fully recognize it myself, and the foundation for investing in people instead of simply funding programs. When I finished, the applause felt warm rather than overwhelming because I no longer measured my worth by the opinions of strangers. As the evening continued, I stepped onto the terrace overlooking the Manhattan skyline. A gentle snowfall drifted across the city, softening the lights below into countless shimmering reflections. Ethan joined me a few moments later, carrying 2 cups of hot chocolate just as he had done months earlier in the community garden. Without saying a word, he handed one to me before resting beside the railing. We watched the snow fall in comfortable silence until he quietly smiled. "Do you remember the first time we met?" he asked. I laughed softly. "I remember wishing I could disappear forever." He shook his head gently. "That is not what I remember. I remember seeing someone who cared more about protecting everyone else's dignity than her own." I looked toward the ballroom where new scholarship recipients laughed with their families, each beginning journeys that would change them in ways they could not yet imagine. "You changed my life," I said quietly. Ethan met my eyes with the same calm sincerity that had carried us through every chapter of our story. "No, Charlotte. We simply crossed paths at exactly the right moment. You were always the one who chose to keep walking." I reached for his hand without hesitation, feeling the quiet certainty that only time and trust can create. Together we stood beneath the falling snow while the city continued moving around us, unaware that the smallest acts of kindness often become the turning points people remember for the rest of their lives. Looking back, I realized the most valuable gift I had ever received was never the scholarship, the recognition, or even the opportunities that followed. It was meeting someone who saw my worth on the day I had forgotten how to see it myself. And perhaps that is how the most meaningful stories always begin, not with perfect people living perfect lives, but with one ordinary moment when compassion quietly changes the direction of a human heart forever.